Thanks, Laurie. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here again. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, pay my respect to their elders, both past and present. I'd like to acknowledge the generous presence of so many of my colleagues, led by my Deputy Leader, Tanya Plibersek. The ultimate responsibility of government is translating present opportunities into future success. This takes vision. A vision for Australia's place in the world, and to plan for us to compete in it and indeed succeed. It takes trust. Because unless governments earn and keep the trust of their people, their agenda will certainly fail. This is the story being played out in front of our eyes. It has been the story of this year, this government. On every issue, the same problem. No vision, no plan, no trust. Tony Abbott has no vision for foreign policy, for Australia's foreign policy future or our economic future. And he is deliberately and willfully deepening the trust deficit, ignoring the wishes and the wisdom of the Australian people. At home and abroad, Tony Abbott and his government are out of touch, and they have let our country down. First, to foreign policy. Earlier this month, Brisbane hosted the leaders of the world's largest economies. Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan worked incredibly hard to elevate the G20 to a leader-level gathering and to secure the 2014 summit for Australia. This once-in-a-generation chance to showcase our nation to the world. And all of us in Labor wanted it to be a success. Then, on that Saturday morning, in 8 excruciating minutes, the Prime Minister delivered a weird, cringeworthy, Little Australia lecture to the global community. In those 8 minutes, he writ low the greatest foreign policy opportunity our nation is likely to have for the next 20 years. There he was, boasting about taking Australia backwards on climate change. There he was, bemoaning the massively difficult job he has as Australian Prime Minister, whining about the unpopularity of his GP tax and his plan for $100,000 degrees, and presenting live to the world a negative character reference of his own people, the Australian public, blaming them, our people, for his government's failures, damning our country as selfish, anti-modern, anti-reform, anti-change. This is a room full of experienced journalists, political commentators. Can any of you nominate a single Australian Prime Minister in your lifetime who would have embarked upon such a mindless melee? Even Billy McMahon would have drawn the line at such depreciation to an international audience. Even Billy Hughes would have thought these remarks narrow and parochial, but more than that, unbecoming. It was a moment that shrieked Tony Abbott's unsuitability for the job of Australian Prime Minister. And in the end, it became the story of the G20. Missed opportunities and a Prime Minister without bearings. It is not too much to say at the G20 that Tony Abbott was left loitering. On the global stage, Tony Abbott was blindsided not once, but twice in 3 days. On the eve of the G20, the world's 2 largest economies announced a historic deal on climate change. The one economic issue the Prime Minister was determined not to talk about It was thrust to the centre of the Brisbane summit, despite his stubborn isolationism. President Obama's call to arms on climate change delivered at the University of Queensland, invoking our Great Barrier Reef, had Tony Abbott privately seething and Julie Bishop publicly rebuking. Then, however, Australians were cheering. Then the Prime Minister failed to see China coming. President Xi, in our parliament, outlined a new idea, a higher level platform, a new concept of China-Australia relations, but the coalition missed it. Blindsided, the Prime Minister didn't see President Xi coming any more than he saw President Obama going. The Prime Minister awkwardly misquoted and misinterpreted the President's ambitions for a modern China, demonstrating to Australia and our world his incapacity to broaden our relationship with our largest trading partner. The Prime Minister was lost in space, while real-world events were moving around him. Remember, even the hyped-up shirt front for President Putin turned into a butterfly kiss. The uncompromising words were left to Germany's Angela Merkel and Canada's Stephen Harper, while our Prime Minister settled for a photo with Putin nursing a couple of bewildered koalas. The ignominy of it. And it wasn't just President Obama's inspirational speech or his decisive actions alongside President Xi that threw Tony Abbott's stubborn reactionism into sharp relief. Soon the Tories in Britain were calling him a flat earther. Japan and Canada announced their substantial contributions to the Green Climate Fund, an institution which our bewildered Prime Minister has previously dismissed as socialism masquerading as environmentalism. You know you've strayed a long way from reality when you're accusing your Canadian brother, Stephen Harper, of being a socialist greenie. You know you're off your game when you can't spot China reaching out for a new and deeper basis of engagement. And what defence did the Prime Minister offer for being caught on the wrong side of every question? How could he explain his lack of bearings, his inability to identify the trends which are shaping our world? The best he could offer was, it's all very well to talk about what might happen in the far distant future. I am not focusing on what might happen in 16 years. I'm focusing on what we're doing now. Tony Abbott dismissed the Australia of 2030, the nation our children will live in, the economy they will work in, the community they will raise their own children in, as the far distant future. That's the real issue with Tony Abbott on the world stage. Not that he looked a fool, but that he squandered the opportunities of a political generation, showing himself to be entirely lacking in vision. A Prime Minister with no knowledge of where he is, with absolutely no sense of longitude or latitude. A man adrift. You might have thought that the Prime Minister would have had a clue as to China's real intent, arriving as President Xi did, with a comprehensive market access agreement. But even this didn't tweak Tony Abbott's intuition. Instead of anticipating President Xi's radical, bold ideas for a deeper relationship, the Prime Minister maintained his government's clumsy, old-fashioned disposition towards China's rising economic influence, dividing every complex foreign and economic policy decision into goodies and baddies, and being satisfied with simply focusing on our significant trade relationship with China, rather than reaching for higher ground. He missed an unparalleled economic opportunity for Australia, forfeiting membership of the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a multilateral attempt to fill an $8 trillion infrastructure gap in our region. If Labor was in government, we would have got the details right and we would have signed up. When we're in government, we will get the details right and we will sign up. Tony Abbott revealed himself as unable to craft a nuanced and sophisticated foreign policy, translating present opportunities into future success. He has showed no vision, no plan for the future of our foreign policy. He let our country down. And you cannot govern today without a vision for tomorrow. And we should look at what Tony Abbott's lack of vision has done to Australia's economy. Growth has slumped. The deficit has doubled. We've reached a 12-year high in unemployment and a 13-year high in youth unemployment. Confidence is down, the tax burden is up, on income, super and small business. Real wages are falling, our standard of living eroding, and the cost of living is up. Health, education, childcare. Australians live with these symptoms and we know the cause. Tony Abbott's unfair budget is throttling our economy and starving our future sources of growth. And oh yes, there are some in the government who think that this budget is just the unfortunate victim of a botched sales job. They play an if-only sort of game. If only Tony hadn't made so many wild and numerate promises before the election. If only the Treasurer and the Finance Minister hadn't been busted savouring a post-fiscal cigar. If only Joe Hockey would stop comparing the GP tax with a couple of beers. Or if Joe Hockey would stop telling pensioners they've never had it so good. Or if Joe Hockey would stop claiming that poor people don't drive cars. In fact, if Joe Hockey would only stop. But it's not about fixing the message, really, is it? It's not about the awful sales job or the stumble-footed sales team. It is the product itself. The problem is the excuses and the surprises, the lies and the consequences of the lies, the spin and the substance it is hiding. We, the Australian people, aren't stupid. We do not recoil from the budget because we do not understand it. We recoil from it because we know exactly what it represents. That's why none of the much-trumpeted budget reboots have made a scrap of difference. Every time they scrape off a barnacle, they reveal a hole in the hull. A new set of talking points won't fix this budget. It's like raising the Titanic or remarketing the Hindenburg, and that's really hard. Australians got this budget from day one. An unfair, dishonest, ideological, foul-hearted attempt to bring down fairness in our society. 6 months after the budget, the Prime Minister is an embarrassment on the world stage, adrift in the national debate, and box office poison in Victoria. And don't imagine that the Prime Minister is dumping any of his budget measures because he's learned or changed his mind. The government is only talking about making changes because they have been forced to do so. In their heart of hearts, they have not changed, and they will never change who they are. As soon as they get the chance, everything will be back on the table, everything will be up for grabs. This government does not understand how much fairness means to the Australian people. We will never change this Prime Minister's mind. All we can do is change this Prime Minister. The word reform gets bandied around a lot by this government, but this budget's not about reform. Let's be clear. Putting a tax on the sick and the vulnerable is not reform. Let's be clear. Leaving young job seekers with nothing to live on and pushing the price of unemployment onto Australian families is not reform. Let's be clear. Burdening Australians who get a degree with a lifetime of debt that is worse for women is not reform. Building new legislative conveyor belts to shift costs from business to consumers, from government to citizens, is not reform. If Tony Abbott really believed these measures were reforms, then he would take them to an election. Real reform takes values, vision and courage. It takes leadership. And real reforming governments keep faith with the Australian people, not mess around with their heads or let them down. They take people into their trust and they repay the people's trust, because Australian people know when governments keep the faith. Because in 2014, the new challenges of the 21st century are already upon us. In our world, the economic, environmental and security challenge of global climate change. In our region, history's most profound economic transformation. Bigger markets, new opportunities, more competition. And at home, we live in a time of slow yet certain demographic shift. 2 generations of retirees alive at the same time. These are the challenges that will define our future. We cannot ignore them, we cannot spin them, and we cannot delay. We can't hope that the cards will just fall the right way for the lucky country, that something will just turn up. Competing in the new world order, creating jobs in a global economy, building national wealth for the long term depends upon Australia getting smarter. I believe we can be the world's smartest, most skillful nation. An international clean energy powerhouse, a services hub in the Asian century, a knowledge centre for the Indo-Pacific, a social justice model for the world. We can be, we must be, we have to be. We have no other historic choice. And an affordable, accessible higher education system is essential to this vision and this future. If Australia is to prosper, if we are to thrive, go forward, not backwards, if we are able to take glad, confident steps into this new millennium, our future workforce must be well educated, highly skilled and internationally competitive. That is why higher education has never been more important to our economy, to our prosperity, to our place in an ever-changing, challenging world. Yet at this very moment, at this tipping point, this economic crunch time, in our economic destiny, the government is building high walls around our universities, keeping some of our smartest out. Labor supports reform in higher education, but dousing opportunity is not reform. A lifetime of student debt is not reform. Making your parents' income an almost perfect predictor of whether or not you go to uni is not reform. Keeping the vast majority of families in the bottom half of incomes from going to uni, what we've seen for these last 40 years in the US, is not reform. In a changing economy where new jobs require higher qualifications, Australia cannot afford to slam the door on aspiration. For Labor, this is heartland and core belief. We should equip our people for the future, not make it harder to go to uni. Kids must be able to fulfil their potential. They must have that chance. In the last year, I visited communities reeling from closures and job losses, from northeast Arnhem Land to the west coast of Tassie. I've met with the skilled and productive shipyard workers in Adelaide and Newcastle, auto manufacturers in Alcoa, plant operators in Geelong, submarine construction workers in Adelaide. Everywhere I go, I hear the same question: where are the new jobs going to come from? By 2020, our nation will need 60,000 new teachers and education assistants. The Whitlam generation of teachers are now over 60. It's time to train their successors, in maths and science especially. We'll now need 90,000 new technicians and tradespeople, engineers, designers, architects and scientists to build the clean energy revolution, to modernise our urban life. 100,000 new medical, allied health and carers to help our ageing population, and the implementation of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. By 2020, 500,000 new jobs will require a diploma qualification or higher. All of us will need the flexibility and resilience to change jobs, to apply skills in different contexts, to keep learning throughout our several careers of our longer working lives. By 2050, there will only be around 2.5 taxpayers for each Australian aged 65 or over. What kind of skills do we want Australians to have? What level of education will nourish them? For me, it is straightforward. I believe in Australians doing high-skilled, well-remunerated work. Jobs are the future, and jobs with a future. Australia should not be a high unemployment country, like some vitality-sapping enclave importing our skills. I believe the next generation of Australians can and should do the jobs our nation needs. And a world-class university system has never been more important to that. A university system underpinned by 3 principles. 1, accessibility and affordability. University places for everyone who's worked hard to meet the entrance requirements and prevailed. 2, excellence. Because higher education should be life-changing, life-enhancing and world-illuminating. 3, balancing autonomy with accountability. Engaging with our universities as a system, not just as a random collection of competing enterprises. Encouraging universities to focus, as they can, on their core strengths. Yet the NatSem modelling reveals the catastrophic injury of the government's plan for our universities and our students. Right now, a young woman who's just finished her Year 12 exams and is contemplating studying science would expect to pay off her HECS debt in around 8 years. Under Tony Abbott's changes, the repayments would take 20 years. She would pay, under Abbott, $100,000 more, a debt of $140,000. She would pay $63,500 in interest alone. And it's not just science studies that are so afflicted and persecuted. For every faculty and in every field, the government is determined to burden our students with a massive debt. The government is locking young Australians into an interest trap. For people in lower earning careers, like teaching, nursing and community work, and for women in particular, Christopher Pyne is playing loan shark. Today, it takes a woman social worker around 9 years to pay off her degree. Under Tony Abbott's changes, she would never pay back her total HECS bill. Despite making over $300,000 in repayments over her lifetime, she would never be free of the Abbott debt sentence. She would retire with a student debt. She will die with a student debt. Imagine dedicating your life to helping, to delivering emotionally for some of the most vulnerable in our community, doing the work of modern secular saints, and having every single paycheck of your career, from your induction to your farewell card, docked by the government for a HECS payment. This is the government's bleak, nasty plan for higher education. The examples I've used today are about women graduates. This is because at the very top of the litany of erosion, the government's plans will have a catastrophic impact on working women. Our economic prosperity, the progress of our society, depends upon the equal treatment of women in our society, on having more women in the workplace, on assisting the march of women through the institutions of power. Yet the government has designed a system to hobble the advance of women. The Abbott plan puts women at a massive financial disadvantage. It inflicts the biggest pain on women who take time off to start and raise a family. Ratcheting up the interest rate on student debt inflicts more pain on women who take time out of the workforce. Each year she spends at home with her children, enlarging and empowering their lives, compounds her debt to Christopher Pyne. And if she goes back to work in a career that is not high paying, teaching, nursing, social work, and indeed journalism, she will find it almost impossible to clear her debt to Christopher Pyne. The Abbott plan is not reform. It is regression. My mum was an educator. She instilled in me a passion for learning and a belief in the power of education. But I wonder if she would have been able to afford to become a teacher if it meant 20 years of debt. I wonder if she would have been able to afford to take time out of work to start a family when she was slugged with a compound interest. Would she have been able to return to study as she did as a mature age student and study law if it meant a $100,000 debt? Would indeed, under the new Abbott punishments, would I and my brother have had our opportunities? When I think about that and a million other comparable stories, it only strengthens my conviction that we must oppose these short-sighted and unfair class war changes to our university system. This is part of who I am, and I am not for turning. So, ladies and gentlemen, yesterday's question time was an almost perfect metaphor for everything that is wrong with this government. A good part of the national debate, and certainly the theme of question time, was about the government's petty and malicious attacks on the ABC and the SBS. The Prime Minister and his front bench said nothing about their ideas. They offered no explanation for their policies. The Prime Minister spent almost no time defending his policies because he knows there is no defence. He knows that he has let Australians down. Today I would say this to Tony Abbott. At some point, leadership is required. At some point you have to stop thinking about saving yourself and start thinking about the Australian people. That is what Labor was doing. 2014 was defined by the force of Labor's resistance. Today I commit to you that Labor will be defined in 2015 by the power of our ideas. I'm always prepared to work with the government on matters where there is bipartisan agreement, as we have on fighting terrorism. But I will never support the creation of an underclass in this country. I will never accept the Abbott government's attempt to dumb down the national debate or indeed weaken the ABC and SBS. We cannot allow our belief in democracy, the legitimacy of the political process, to be reduced. We cannot allow our people to drift from the centre to populism and extremism and the political equivalent of cults, searching not for higher ground, but grovelling in the mire of mediocrity. We know that Australians want to believe in politics, in an authentic, sincere political process that can speak to their lives and allow people to believe they can make meaningful changes to the world in which they live. It's our job to live up to that. We embrace our responsibility. I recognise that Labor has to rebuild the nation's faith in us. We are determined to earn the trust of the Australian people. We will earn their trust and we will repay their trust. Today I give Australians this commitment. We will seek a mandate based on a positive plan. We will not ask the Australian people to vote for us just because we are not the Abbott government. Australians deserve better than the government that they're suffering through. They deserve better than a Prime Minister and a government whose contempt for our people and their election promises debases our democracy. But at the next election, Labor will offer the nation more than a list of Tony Abbott's lies. It will offer more than what the government is not. We're prepared to work on the big policies that go beyond parliamentary terms and go to intergenerational changes. Changes which will require the interests of both our grandchildren as well as our parents to be considered. We will earn the trust by hard work of the Australian people with our ideas, our principles and our vision. This is what Australians expect. This is what Australians deserve. An alternative government reaching for higher ground. This is what we shall offer in the year ahead. Thank you.